Good morning, class. We are going to continue our conversation about George W. Bush today, and I just wanted to cover a couple of other specific things that were domestic issues that George W. Bush tried to address. And he addressed them to varying degrees successfully, some unsuccessfully, and some extremely successfully. But a couple of specific ones, or a few specific ones that we're going to talk about today, are major ones that we did not hit yesterday. So, one of the first ones that I would like to address is the issue of Social Security reform. So, George W. Bush was one of the first presidents in recent history to really try to reform the Social Security system. And part of the problem with the Social Security system is the fact that it is underfunded. It is severely underfunded. So the idea behind Social Security was that there was supposed to be an account, a bank account, where money was paid into it. It would sit there, and then when an individual retired, the money that they paid into that fund would be paid back to them. Um, Now, when Social Security first came out under FDR, it was referred to as an old age pension, and the idea was just to help the elderly during the Great Depression. And then the idea was, like I just said, to you pay in, the government holds the money, and then they pay it out to the individual that paid in. Well, the government being the government, they like to spend money they don't have, which is why we have over $20 trillion in debt, which is an astounding amount of money, like a dizzying amount of money to owe. Uh, but that being just, we're going to skid on past that here. The fact that we have a massive national debt, and we're going to talk about the fact that the government spends money it doesn't have. And so Social Security in that regard was underfunded. So who funds Social Security? Well, the structure of the system is set up in such a way that there are workers that are currently working and they pay into the system. And then there are retirees who are retired and they receive the money that the workers that are currently working pay in. So it's not like you pay in now and then you reap later. It's you pay in now and these people are reaping currently. Well, that is great when there are enough workers per retiree. So George W. Bush noticed, though, with our demographic trends, that what was actually happening was we were losing because of the baby boom. Right, the baby boomers we have coming up, and we have about 2.5 to 3 workers per retiree. Well, what we need to fund the system effectively is about 5 workers per retiree. We can really still fund it with maybe 4 workers per retiree. But the way it's currently set up right now, we have about 2.5 workers per retiree, and that's not currently counting the 20 plus million unemployed that occurred recently just due to this current pandemic. That's when unemployment is 5% ish or under. So George W. Bush thought, well, what if we, instead of counting on the government to fund this, especially with the demographic trends that we have, what if we partially privatize retirement for Social Security? Now, there's a risk involved with this. Part of the risk is anytime that one invests in the stock market, in a privatized retirement fund, there is a chance for loss. And some people can lose everything. Um, but there's also a chance for greater gain, and the government can't spend money because it's a privatized retirement. Well, I shouldn't say they can't. They could find a way if they wanted to, but they generally won't. So George W. Bush proposes Social Security reform, but a lot of people resisted the idea of a privatized, or at least partially privatized, Social Security system. Uh, those of the opposing party, so George W. Bush was a Republican, those in the Democrat Party said, this is a horrible idea. It's just a profiteering, money gaining idea. Whereas those on the Republican side were saying, well, Social Security is underfunded. We really need to handle this so the national debt does not just spiral out of control. And if you've noticed, the national debt has spiraled out of control. Just a side note, this wasn't in my plan to talk about today, but under George W. Bush, the national debt basically doubled. So even though he's talking about responsible spending and reining in the government and how the government spends money too much and Social Security is underfunded, the national debt, these are big, I'm rounding here, but the national debt went from about 5 trillion to about 10 trillion under the 8 years of George W. Bush's administration. In all fairness, under Obama's 8 years of his administration, the national debt went from about 10 trillion to about 20 trillion. So both of those presidents doubled the national debt. Now, next, the another thing that George W. Bush addressed was the issue of education. America has we have a specific and really an unprecedented challenge educationally that a lot of other nations that are ranked very highly in their education system don't have. And that is that we have compulsory education for everyone, and we educate generally everyone at the same level. All right. Now, I will say there is nuance there. We do have AP courses that are not compulsory that people can choose to take, and we have honors classes that are not compulsory that people can choose to take. But generally, at the high school level, everyone in America is required by law until a certain age to be educated. Well, our educational scores are not as high as some other nations, particularly Scandinavian nations. And so George W. Bush wanted to address some things like low testing rates, high dropout rate. So he pushed for an educational initiative called No Child Left Behind. And this is an interesting initiative. And there was a good idea behind this. It was supposed to push schools to excel. But the problem was that it ended up penalizing schools that didn't meet the criteria. So as far as testing rates and literacy rates and things like that, it pushed for schools to hit 100% rates eventually. And sometimes that's impossible because while we can push for that, there are outliers and there are compounding factors. And so it ended up, if the schools didn't hit those figures, penalizing them by reducing funding. So what it really ended up doing was removing funding from some of the schools that needed it most. So No Child Left Behind was not really one of the better pieces of legislation that the Bush administration pushed for, and it caused a lot of issues in the educational field. So Social Security and education reform are two major things that George W. Bush pushed for that we didn't talk about yesterday. Social Security reform didn't work out all that well. Education reform didn't really work out all that well. We did talk about tax cuts yesterday. That worked out generally pretty well. And other things like interest rate changes and other economic changes that the Bush administration pushed for. Some of those things worked out well, but things like Social Security reform and education reform, those were not some of the major successes that George W. Bush experienced domestically. So I just wanted to hit on those couple of things today just to give a whole, like a holistic view of the Bush administration. So we talked about a lot of things he did good yesterday. Now we're talking about a couple of things that were more challenges that seemed to be unresolved. All right, so that is the whole picture of the Bush administration. In tomorrow's Zoom, we're going to be talking about the Obama administration. So I really look forward to it. Have a great day.